I checked into the motel late in the evening after a long day of meetings and travel. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Faded carpet in the hallway, a smell of stale air and cleaning chemicals mixed together, and dim yellow bulbs above each door. My room was on the second floor, halfway down the hall from the stairwell. There was no elevator, just a narrow set of stairs by the vending machines. The place didn't even have a restaurant, so I knew from the start there would be no real room service here. Inside my room, everything felt quiet in that strange way motels do. Not truly silent, but filled with faint hums and creaks you stop noticing after a while. The heater under the window clicked on and off with a metallic ping each time it started. The walls were thin enough that I could faintly hear someone in the next room watching TV. I tossed my bag on the bed, plugged in my laptop, and went through emails for a couple of hours. By the time I finished, it was already past 11, and I was thinking about getting some sleep. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, more like a soft, polite tap, almost hesitant. I paused for a moment, listening. Then a man's voice said, "Room service." His tone was casual, but there was something about it that didn't sound quite right, maybe too flat, too calm. I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything. This motel didn't even have a kitchen, as far as I knew. I said through the door that I hadn't asked for anything. The voice came again, a little closer to the door this time. "You don't have to pay, just take it." That made my skin prickle. Nobody gives free food at motels, especially not ones like this. I didn't open the door. Instead, I moved quietly to the peephole and looked through. A man stood there in a dark jacket, holding a metal tray covered with a white cloth. I couldn't see his whole face clearly because the peephole warped the edges, but I could see his eyes, and they weren't fixed on my door. They kept darting left and right, scanning the hallway like he was checking if anyone was coming. His grip on the tray looked tight, knuckles pale in the yellow light from the hall sconce. I stepped back from the door without saying anything more. My first thought was that maybe he had the wrong room, but his behavior didn't fit. He wasn't looking confused. He was alert, almost impatient. I pulled my cell phone from the nightstand and called the front desk. A tired-sounding man answered, and I told him there was someone at my door claiming to be room service. I said I hadn't ordered anything, and that I was concerned. The clerk was quiet for a moment before telling me there was no staff on the second floor at all, and no room service offered at the motel. He told me to stay inside and lock the door. When I went back to the peephole, the man was gone. At first, I thought maybe he'd just left, but then I noticed the tray. It was sitting right on the floor, still covered. The hallway was empty otherwise. I didn't open the door. Instead, I kept watching for a couple of minutes. The hallway was still, nothing moving. My pulse was loud in my ears. Eventually, I turned off the lights in my room and sat in the chair by the window, where I could see both the door and the parking lot below. From the window, I could see maybe half the lot. A few cars were scattered around, but there were plenty of empty spots. The only movement came from a car parked near the far edge, just under a flickering light. The driver's seat was occupied, but I couldn't make out the face. The engine wasn't running, and the headlights were off. Whoever it was just sat there. After about 10 minutes, I looked back, through the peephole again. The tray was still there. My mind kept going through possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of scam, get someone to open their door, and then push their way in. Maybe it was worse. Another 5 minutes passed, and I saw movement in the parking lot again. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from this distance and in the poor light, I could tell it was the same jacket as the guy with the tray. He walked quickly toward the side of the building, out of my view from the window. I went back to the peephole, heart pounding. The tray was gone. I didn't hear any footsteps, no knock this time, nothing. Just silence. I sat back down in the chair, keeping my eyes on the window, half expecting to see him walk back to the car. But the car stayed empty. It was nearly 1 a.m. before I finally saw him again. He came from the opposite side of the lot, this time carrying nothing. He walked to the car, got in, and drove away without turning on his headlights until he reached the street. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak from the hallway made me tense. I double-checked the lock, the chain, even pushed the desk chair under the doorknob just in case. In the morning, I went down to the front desk before checking out. The clerk on duty was different from the one I spoke to the night before. I told him about what had happened, keeping my voice low so no one else could overhear. He listened, his face tightening as I described the man and the tray. He said that a couple of months ago, there had been reports of people trying to get guests to open their doors late at night by pretending to deliver food. In one case, the guest had opened the door, and two men tried to force their way in. That guest had managed to slam the door and lock it again before anything happened, but the police never caught anyone. I asked if there were cameras. He said there were a few outside, but none in the hallways. Then he shrugged, like there wasn't much else to say. When I walked out to my car, I glanced around the lot. Everything looked normal in the daylight, just another aging motel in a forgettable part of town. But as I pulled onto the road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see a dark jacket or that same car following behind. For the rest of the trip, I booked hotels with inside lobbies, security, and cameras in the halls. I never forgot the way that man's eyes kept flicking up and down the hallway, like he was waiting for something. It wasn't the knock that bothered me the most, or even the tray. It was the fact that he knew my room number. That detail stayed with me long after I left. And it still does. I travel a lot for work. Accounting audits. Nothing glamorous. Just me, my laptop, and endless spreadsheets. Last November, I decided to give myself a small break before a client visit in upstate New York. I booked a weekend alone in an Airbnb, a converted barn that looked rustic and cozy in the photos. Weathered wood siding, big windows, string lights on the porch. The kind of place people post on Instagram with a mug of coffee and a blanket. The reviews were solid. Every guest seemed to love it. The hosts were described as friendly but not intrusive, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took about 5 hours from where I was working last. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting that deep orange glow across the hills. The air smelled like cold leaves and wood smoke. The barn sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by tall, bare trees. There was a single lamppost near the porch that threw a warm circle of light on the steps. No other houses in sight, just the sound of wind moving through the branches. Check-in was easy. The key was in a lockbox, the hosts weren't there, and I liked that. Inside, it was quiet, warm, and well-decorated, worn rugs, a small kitchen with open shelving, an overstuffed couch facing a stone fireplace. It had that get murdered here vibe you sometimes get from remote rentals, but in a weird way, I liked that. It felt private, safe enough. That first night was uneventful. I opened a bottle of wine, read for a while, and fell asleep on the couch with the fire still burning. I didn't hear anything unusual. The second night was different. I was in bed by around midnight. The bedroom was at the far end of the barn, with just one window facing the woods. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps above me. It didn't make sense. This was a one-story building. The sound wasn't loud, more like slow, careful shifting weight, a board creaking here and there. My first thought was maybe it was an animal on the roof, but it didn't sound like that. It was too deliberate. I sat there in the dark, heart thudding, holding my breath. After maybe a minute, it stopped. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was just overreacting because I was alone in a quiet place. In the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I decided to look around. That's when I noticed something strange in the bedroom closet. The closet wasn't big, just a small space with a few coats hanging inside and some extra blankets folded on a shelf. But the back panel didn't look right. The wood wasn't flush with the wall. There was a faint gap along one edge. I knocked on it, and it sounded hollow. I moved the coats aside and felt along the seam. My fingers brushed against a small metal latch tucked behind the fabric. I hesitated for a few seconds, then pulled it. The panel swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase going down into darkness. It wasn't going up, it was going down. There was no mention of a basement in the listing. No sign of anything like this in the photos. The air that drifted up from below was cool and smelled faintly damp, like stone and earth. The steps were steep, made of old wood. I told myself it was probably storage. Maybe they used it for supplies. but the part of me that trusted my instincts wanted no part of it. Something about that hidden space felt wrong in a way I can't explain. I closed the panel, latched it, and hung the coats back in front of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small noise made me tense. I kept hearing faint creaks, soft enough that I couldn't be sure they were real, but they felt too rhythmic, too intentional, like someone was moving very slowly, trying not to be heard. Around 3 a.m., there was a sound that cut through every rational explanation I had been clinging to, a click coming from inside the closet. Not the wood settling, not pipes. A distinct, metallic click, like a latch being released. I sat up. Every nerve in my body lit up. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, wrapped my hand around its base, and held it like a weapon. I walked slowly toward the closet. The air in the room felt heavier, colder. The panel was slightly open. Not much, just an inch, maybe 2, but it had been shut before. I didn't touch it. I just shoved the dresser in front of the closet, pushing it tight against the door, and sat in the armchair by the bed with the lamp in my lap, eyes on that spot until the sky outside started to lighten. I didn't go back to sleep. I didn't even get into bed again. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag fast, avoiding looking at the closet. I loaded my car and left without cleaning up, without sending a thank you message, without doing any of the usual Airbnb checkout things. I didn't say anything to the hosts. I just drove away, the feeling in my gut telling me that speaking up might somehow make things worse. A week later, I got curious. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I had overreacted. I went back to Airbnb to look at the listing. It was gone. Not unavailable. Completely removed. The host profile was gone too. I searched the address on Google Maps. When I switched to Street View, my stomach dropped. The building in the photo wasn't the same one I had stayed in. The location matched, same gravel driveway, same line of trees, but the structure was different. The one in the image had a different roofline, different windows. The barn I had been inside wasn't there. I checked older Street View images, thinking maybe it had been renovated, but the barn from the Airbnb photos never appeared in any of them. It was always the other building. I sat there for a long time, staring at my screen. There was no way to explain it that made sense. No trace of the place existed online anymore. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. The footsteps, the hidden staircase, the panel opening on its own. Someone had been in that space beneath me, not just living there, waiting. I didn't see them. I didn't hear a voice. But I know, without a single doubt, that I wasn't alone in that house. And the fact that it's gone now, erased, makes me think that whoever was down there is still out there, and they don't want anyone finding that place again. After a 10-hour drive, my body felt like it was made of sandbags. My neck was stiff, my eyes burned, and my lower back ached from sitting so long. I pulled into the motel's cracked parking lot just after dark. The neon sign out front blinked unevenly, the red letters spelling vacancy flickering like they were struggling to stay lit. The building itself was a long row of doors under a flat roof, all the same faded tan color. A few of the rooms had lights on behind thin curtains. The air smelled faintly of gasoline from the road and something damp, like mildew coming from the nearby drainage ditch. The front office was small, lit with a single buzzing fluorescent tube. The clerk barely looked at me as I signed the check-in slip. My name, my license plate, the time I arrived. He slid me a plastic key card for room 15. I took it without much thought. All I wanted was to get horizontal and let my brain shut down for the night. The walk to my room was quiet except for the hum of the ice machine near the middle of the building. My footsteps on the concrete walkway sounded louder than I expected. I noticed a single security camera above the hallway, pointing toward the office, but none near my door. Room 15 was toward the far end, 2 doors away from the last unit, which was dark. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old cigarette smoke, the kind that never fully leaves. The carpet had a faded floral pattern, worn thin in a path from the door to the bed. The air conditioner under the window rattled when I turned it on, coughing out air that was cooler but carried a dusty smell. I tossed my bag onto the small table. kicked off my shoes, and flopped down on the bed. The sheets were stiff and cold, probably from too much industrial laundry detergent. I shifted the pillow to get comfortable, and that's when I heard it, a faint buzzing. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A little like the hum of the air conditioner, but with a rhythm. A short vibration, pause, short vibration. My first thought was that my phone had slipped between the sheets. I sat up, patted the pillow, then pulled the pillowcase off. Nothing inside, but the lumpy stuffing. The buzzing stopped for a moment. I figured maybe it had been the AC after all. I lay back down, but a few seconds later, it came again.
Clearer now.
Definitely the sound of a phone vibrating. My phone was on the table, screen dark. I pressed my ear to the mattress, and the sound grew louder. It wasn't in the sheets. It was under me. I pushed the mattress toward the headboard and leaned over the side. That's when I saw it. Duct taped to the wooden bed frame, just above the box spring, was a small black flip phone. The screen was cracked but glowing faintly. It buzzed again. I reached under and peeled away a strip of the silver tape. The phone came loose in my hand, still buzzing. The screen showed a text message. Room 15 confirmed. It wasn't from a saved contact, just a number I didn't recognize. The battery icon was low, but as I watched, another message came through. Same exact words. Room 15 confirmed. Then another. Room 15 confirmed. The messages were coming in every few seconds. No punctuation, no variation, just the same question over and over. My stomach tightened. I don't know why, but something about the repetition felt worse than if it had been a threat.
It wasn't asking me.
It was like someone else was being told I was here. I stood up holding the phone. My first thought was to take it to the front desk, but then I looked at the door. The chain lock was hanging loose. I slid it into place and turned the deadbolt, but the keycard lock still made me uneasy. If someone had access to the room before me, they could have more than just the keycard. The air in the room felt heavier. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I put the phone on the table and stared at it, waiting for the next buzz. It came right on cue. I checked the sender number, the same one. The messages weren't stopping. I yanked my bag from the table, stuffed my things back inside without folding them, and slung it over my shoulder.
My shoes were still by the bed.
I shoved my feet into them without tying the laces. When I stepped outside, the air was cooler, but the night felt oddly still. I glanced toward the parking lot. A few cars were scattered around, but there was no one outside. I walked quickly toward the office, keeping my eyes on the doors I passed. The clerk looked up when I stepped in, but his face was unreadable. I set the keycard on the counter and said I wouldn't be staying after all. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, typed something into his computer, and slid the card aside. I didn't mention the phone. I didn't hand it to him. Something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I walked straight to my car, unlocked it, and tossed the phone into the passenger seat. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, scanning the lot. From where I was parked, I could see room 15's door. The curtains in the window didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be inside already, or watching from a nearby room. My eyes kept darting to the far end of the building, where a tall chain-link fence marked the property line. Beyond it was just darkness. Finally, I turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. I backed out slowly, headlights sweeping across the building. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving behind the curtain of room 15. Not a quick motion, not someone brushing past. It was a slow shift, like someone standing there had leaned slightly to one side. I didn't wait to see more. I pulled out onto the road and didn't look back. I drove for 20 minutes before I felt far enough away to breathe normally. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. The phone was still in the passenger seat, screen dark now. I didn't touch it. I found another motel off the highway, one of those chain places with a brightly lit lobby and a night clerk in a polo shirt. I paid in cash, gave a fake name, and locked the door behind me as soon as I got inside. It was close to midnight when the phone buzzed again. Just once. I didn't want to look, but I did. The message was the same. Room 15 confirmed. That's when I realized the battery should have died hours ago. I wrapped the phone in a towel and shoved it deep into the bottom of my bag. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak from the hallway made my chest tighten. Every car that pulled into the lot made me glance toward the window. In the morning, I drove to a rest stop and threw the phone into a dumpster behind the building. I stood there for a second, making sure it was gone, then got back in my car. I never reported it. I didn't want to explain, and I doubted anyone would do much about it anyway. Still, weeks later, I sometimes catch myself thinking about that first night, about how someone had gone out of their way to hide a phone under that mattress, waiting for someone to check in, about the endless messages, all the same, all so casual in their wording, and about that shadow behind the curtain, standing in the room I had just left. Whoever they were waiting for, I was never supposed to know, but they definitely knew I had been there. The motel I stayed in that night was the kind of place you end up at when you've driven too long, when your body aches from sitting and your eyes sting from headlights. It sat right off a two-lane highway that barely had any traffic after dark. The sign out front had a few bulbs missing, and the letters buzzed faintly in the night. The front parking lot was decently lit, a few yellow lamps mounted high on poles casting weak circles on the cracked asphalt. But there was a smaller parking area in the back, barely lit at all. That's where my room was facing. The room itself was plain. Thin carpet with stains worn in from years of use, 2 beds that dipped toward the middle, and a small table shoved under the window. The curtains were thin enough that if someone stood close on the outside, they could probably see movement inside if the light was on. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, even though the sign on the door said non-smoking. The heater clanged every few minutes, like metal shifting somewhere deep inside it. I had checked in around 10:30 p.m. and hadn't noticed much activity. The back lot was almost empty, except for a pickup truck parked 2 spaces over. I assumed it belonged to one of the other guests. After I locked up, I sat on the bed scrolling through my phone, trying to wind down before sleep. At some point, I drifted off. It must have been close to 3 a.m. when I woke up again. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of the heater. Then, a glow swept across the wall, headlights moving slowly. My eyes adjusted, and I realized they weren't coming from the front lot. They were from behind the motel, cutting across my window. I pushed the curtain aside just a sliver. A white van had backed into one of the spaces, directly across from my room, with its rear doors facing me. Both doors were wide open. Inside, it was dark. I couldn't see much beyond the shadow of the door frames. No one was standing near it. No one got out. It just sat there, engine off, doors open like it was waiting for something. I let the curtain fall back into place. My first thought was that maybe someone was unloading something, but why at 3 a.m? And why just sit there with the doors open? I kept listening, waiting to hear footsteps, voices, anything. Nothing came. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. I started to think maybe I just imagined seeing the doors open, so I checked again. Still open. Still no one. Then I heard them, footsteps outside. Slow. Heavy enough that I could hear the gravel shifting, but spaced out, like the person was stopping every few steps. They were moving along the walkway outside the rooms. My room was on the ground floor, and the walkway ran right along the windows and doors. The steps grew closer, then stopped completely. I stayed still. The heater clicked off, and the silence felt louder. The steps started again, closer now, until they were right outside my door. Then they stopped. I didn't move. My eyes were fixed on the thin strip of light at the bottom of the door. There was no shadow, but I could hear faint breathing, slow, controlled, like someone was trying to be quiet. They stayed there for what felt like minutes, then the steps moved away. I thought they had gone, but then I heard them again, coming back from the same direction. Same slow, deliberate pace. This time, they didn't pause at my door for long. Just a brief stop, then more steps, and then silence again. A minute later, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. The sound faded toward the van. I lifted the curtain again, just enough to see. The open doors were still there, but now a figure was standing by the driver's side. I couldn't see their face. They got in, but the van didn't start right away. They just sat there, no movement, no sound. I didn't watch for long. My stomach was knotted, and my skin felt too tight. I let the curtain drop again and sat on the edge of the bed. waiting for the sound of an engine. Eventually, the van started up. The rear doors were still open as it rolled out of the lot. It made a slow turn and disappeared down the side street behind the motel. It was quiet again. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps outside my door, the pauses, the breathing, every small noise in the room, the hum of the heater, the pop of the wood in the walls, made me sit up and listen. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to force the flimsy lock. The chain latch looked old, screws barely holding into the wood. When the sun finally started to lighten the sky, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to loosen. The back lot looked empty except for the same pickup truck from the night before. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside. That's when I saw them. 2 cigarette butts directly under my window. They were fresh, not rain-soaked, not flattened. The filters were still white, but the smell of smoke lingered in the air. One was crushed under a shoe, the other lying neatly on its side. I hadn't heard anyone smoke out there earlier in the night. Whoever it was had been standing right there, close enough to hear me if I moved, close enough to see me if I'd opened the curtain too far. I didn't bother going to the front desk. I didn't think they'd care, and I didn't want to stick around to explain it. I packed my things in silence, loaded my car, and drove out of that lot without looking back. I kept thinking about the van as I pulled onto the highway. How it had just sat there with the doors open waiting. How the person had walked past my room more than once before returning to it. How the cigarette butts were right under my window, like they'd been watching my room for a while. By the time I was a few miles down the road, I realized I had been gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. I didn't feel fully calm until I was halfway to the next town, with the motel far behind me. Even now, I don't know if they were there for me or for someone else. But the thought that they might have been waiting for me to make one wrong move, has stayed with me ever since. I checked into the motel late in the evening after a long day of driving. It was one of those one-story roadside motels with all the rooms lined up in a row, each door facing the parking lot. The neon sign out front buzzed faintly, and the gravel lot was half empty. My room was near the far end, away from the main office. The door was the kind you opened with an old-fashioned metal key, the kind that felt loose in the lock. Inside, the room was basic. 2 beds with stiff floral bedspreads, a small table with a single chair, a TV from the early 2000s, and a bathroom with a flickering light over the mirror. The carpet was worn down to the threads and spots, and the air smelled faintly like stale smoke, even though it was marked non-smoking. I remember setting my bags down and locking the door behind me, sliding the chain lock across just to feel a little safer. I didn't have much energy for anything, so I took a quick shower, left the bathroom light on as a nightlight, and climbed into bed. I kept the TV on low, just for some background noise. Through the thin curtains, I could see the dim glow from the parking lot lamps, but otherwise, it was quiet. At some point during the night, I woke up and checked my phone. It was 4:02 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, the faint metallic rattle of the doorknob turning. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock it, but then I remembered sliding the chain across. Before I could even get out of bed, the lock clicked and the door swung inward a few inches, just enough for the light from outside to spill in. The chain caught, stopping it from opening all the way. Then a hand reached in through the gap, pale fingers stretching for the chain, fumbling, trying to lift it free from the bracket. The sound of the metal links scraping together was sharp in the still room. My heart slammed in my chest. I shot out of bed, shoved the door hard, and slammed it shut. The chain clinked back into place. My hands were shaking as I turned the lock again, even though it had clearly been unlocked with the key. I stayed there for a moment, just listening. No footsteps. No running. Whoever it was hadn't said a word. I picked up my phone and called the front desk, keeping my voice low. The clerk's voice was calm, but they insisted no one had been given my key. They said they'd make a note and check in the morning. I barely slept after that. Every little sound made me sit up. Cars passing on the road, wind rattling the bushes outside, the hum of the ice machine 2 doors down. I kept glancing at the curtains, half expecting a shadow to pass by. My mind kept replaying the moment when the hand came through the door, the way it had moved like it knew exactly what it was reaching for. When the first light of morning started to filter in, I finally got up. My eyes felt heavy from barely resting. I decided I'd pack my stuff and leave as soon as possible. I stepped outside to load my bag into my car, and that's when I saw it, just under the low hedge next to my door, half hidden by the branches, was a small black duffel bag. It wasn't mine. The fabric was dusty, and the zipper was halfway open. I crouched down and hesitated for a second before pulling it out. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, men's jeans, a gray hoodie, socks. At the bottom, wrapped in a shirt, was a large hunting knife with a black handle. The blade was stained, though I couldn't tell if it was rust or something else. There was also a small, cheap flip phone with a cracked screen. The battery light was blinking like it had just a little charge left. I stood there for a moment, my hands gripping the bag. My first thought was that whoever had tried my door last night had dropped it. Maybe they'd been hiding there before I came out. I looked around the lot. 2 other cars were parked a few doors down, but there was no one in sight. I took the bag to my car, set it in the trunk, and drove straight to the front office. The clerk was behind the counter, scrolling on their phone. I put the bag on the counter and told them I'd found it outside my room. Their face changed when they saw what was inside. They took it into the back without saying much. I didn't stick around to ask questions. I left the key on the counter and drove out of the lot, my hands tight on the wheel. As I passed the last bend before the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the motel shrinking behind me. I couldn't stop picturing that hand reaching into my room. Later that day, after I'd been driving for hours, I stopped for gas and sat in my car for a moment. My phone buzzed with a news alert from the county I'd just left. It said a man had been arrested near the highway that morning, found walking with a stolen car and a set of motel keys. The article didn't mention the bag, but it did say police were investigating him for multiple break-ins along that stretch of road. It made sense then. The way the key had turned so easily in my door, the way he'd gone straight for the chain like he'd done it before. He probably had a pocket full of keys from different motels. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't used that chain, if I'd been too tired to bother. For the rest of that trip, I didn't stay in another roadside motel. I stuck to bigger hotels with indoor hallways, multiple locks, and cameras. But even now, when I'm in any hotel room, I always check the lock twice before I sleep. I can still see that pale hand pushing through the door, reaching for the chain, like it belonged there. The motel had indoor hallways, narrow and dim, with a thin, faded carpet that had a pattern worn almost flat from years of people dragging their luggage down it. I was at the far end of the building, 2 doors from the emergency exit that led out into the parking lot. I'd picked this place because it was cheap, had a late-night check-in, and was a short drive from where I needed to be the next morning. I didn't think about how far my room was from the lobby, or how alone it felt at the end of that quiet hallway. When I checked in earlier, I noticed how the receptionist barely looked up when I gave my name. He handed me the key card without a word about the amenities or breakfast. I'd taken the elevator up to the 2nd floor, walked past the ice machine and a row of closed doors, and kept going till there were no more rooms past mine except for the glowing red exit sign at the end. The hallway felt strangely isolated, like I'd been tucked away out of sight from everything else in the building. By the time I got in, it was late enough that I didn't bother with the TV. I unpacked my bag just enough to get my toothbrush and a change of clothes, then shut off the lights except for the small lamp on the nightstand. The room itself was plain, beige walls, 2 full-sized beds with stiff blankets, and a window that looked out over the parking lot. My car was parked almost directly beneath it, and I made a mental note that I could check on it easily from up here if I needed to. The sound of the heater kicking on every few minutes was the only noise I heard after I settled in. The hallway outside was silent. No footsteps, no voices, no doors closing. Around 1:15 a.m., I was lying in bed scrolling on my phone when I heard it, soft, slow whistling. It wasn't a song I recognized, just a steady, rising and falling tune, like someone was casually passing the time. At first, it was faint, like it was coming from the far end of the hallway. My head lifted from the pillow. The heater wasn't running at that moment, so the sound carried clearly in the still air. The whistling grew louder. The person wasn't rushing. They were walking slowly, taking their time, the sound echoing slightly in the narrow hallway. Each step must have been in sync with their breathing because the pace of the whistle never changed. It didn't break or falter. I didn't move. I just sat there listening. The carpet outside was thin enough that footsteps sometimes made a faint thump, but I didn't hear any footfalls. Only the whistling. When it reached my door, it stopped. I could feel my heart pounding. I stared at the door, watching the thin line of light underneath. Nothing moved. No shadow passed by. I was holding my breath without realizing it, straining to hear anything. A hand on the handle, the soft click of the lock. But there was nothing. Just silence. I waited. Maybe a minute passed, maybe more. Then the whistling started again, this time moving away down the hallway, fading until I couldn't hear it anymore. I stayed awake long after that. Every creak in the building made me tense. I thought about looking out into the hallway, but the idea of opening that door, even a crack, didn't feel smart. Instead, I kept the lamp on, sat up in bed, and told myself it was probably just another guest. Maybe someone coming back from a smoke outside, trying not to wake anyone up. Eventually, I stretched out again, still in my clothes, and kept my phone close in case I needed to call the front desk. The heater rattled back on, and the noise gave me something else to focus on. About an hour later, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't in the hallway. It was outside my window. The same slow, steady whistling drifted up from below. My room was on the second floor, and the only thing under my window was the parking lot. The sound wasn't muffled. It was as if the person was standing directly beneath my window, facing up toward it. I turned my head slowly toward the curtains. They were shut, but a thin slice of light from the lot outside slipped through the gap where they didn't quite meet. I didn't move closer. I just sat there, frozen, trying to picture the layout of the building. There was no walkway outside my window, no balcony or ledge someone could stand on. Whoever it was had to be on the ground. The whistling didn't stop. It kept going, as calm and even as before. I thought about peeking through the curtain, but my mind immediately pictured a face staring back at me if I did. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound faded. Not abruptly, just slowly, as if the person was walking away into the distance. I stayed by the bed, listening hard for the sound of footsteps on pavement or the rumble of a car engine, but there was nothing, just the heater kicking on again. I didn't sleep after that. I kept the light on and stayed in the chair by the window until the sky began to lighten. Around 6:30, I pulled back the curtain. My car was still there. The lot was empty except for a few other vehicles spaced out near the other end. No one was outside. When I checked out later that morning, I didn't mention it to the man at the desk. He barely looked up from his computer when I handed him my keycard. I walked out into the cold air, scanning the lot again before I got into my car. Everything looked normal, but as I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing by the edge of the lot, watching me go. Even now, I don't know if they had been in the hallway first and then moved outside, or if there were two different people. I only know the sound of that whistling still sticks in my head, slow, even and completely unhurried, like they knew exactly how long they wanted me to hear it. I booked the basement Airbnb because it was cheap, close to where I needed to be for work, and had decent reviews. The listing said it was a shared entrance, but with my own locked space. I figured that just meant I'd walk through a common hallway to get to my unit. The photos showed a small but clean basement studio, white walls, a small couch, a bed, and a kitchenette. Nothing fancy, but enough for a few nights. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Philadelphia. When I pulled up, the street was lined with small houses, most with neat lawns and trimmed bushes. The host's house looked ordinary, beige siding, a little porch, 2 cars in the driveway. I parked on the street and grabbed my suitcase. The entrance was around the side of the house. A set of steps led down to a door, which opened into a short hallway. The hallway had a door to the left, which I assumed went upstairs to the host's part of the house, and straight ahead was my unit. The host wasn't there when I arrived, They had left the key in a lockbox by the door. Inside, the place looked just like the pictures. The floor was laminate wood. The bed had a gray comforter, and there was a tiny kitchen counter with a microwave and a mini fridge. The bathroom was small but clean. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaning spray. I unpacked, set my laptop on the desk, and got comfortable. That night, around 11 p.m., I remembered I'd left my work bag in the car. I put on my jacket and stepped out into the shared hallway. As soon as I opened my door, a small red light caught my eye. Mounted high on the wall was a black motion-activated security camera. I stopped for a second because I didn't remember seeing it earlier. When I walked past it, it pivoted, following me. The little motor inside made a faint whirring noise as it turned. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the host had put it up recently for security, or maybe I just didn't notice it when I first came in. Still, it felt strange that it was aimed right where I had to walk. I went to my car, grabbed my bag, and when I came back inside, the camera followed me again. I didn't like how it moved so smoothly, as if tracking me. Back in my room, I locked the door. I sat on the bed for a while, thinking about it, and pulled up the Airbnb listing again on my phone. I scrolled through all the photos. No camera. Not in the hallway, not anywhere. I checked the description. Nothing about security cameras inside. It bothered me, but I told myself it wasn't worth making a big deal over. I tried to sleep, but the thought of that thing moving by itself made me restless. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I thought I'd just stirred in my sleep, but then I heard it, a faint click-click-click from somewhere just outside my door. I lay still, listening. It was rhythmic, mechanical, almost like a camera lens adjusting. I got up quietly, walked to the door, and opened it just a crack. The hallway was dimly lit by a small light near the stairs. The camera was aimed directly at my door. As I watched, it slowly tilted up, then down, then side to side, like it was scanning. The movement was deliberate, slow enough to seem like it was searching for something. A shiver ran through me. I shut the door quietly, locked it again, and sat back on the bed, fully awake now. I stayed like that for hours, just listening. Every so often, I'd hear the little motor hum faintly through the wall. When daylight came, I got dressed and went upstairs to leave. The host was in the kitchen, drinking coffee. I mentioned the camera, expecting maybe they'd say it was for security. But instead, they just gave me this small, tight smile and said it wasn't theirs. No explanation. No sign of surprise or concern. Just that smile. That was enough for me. I went back downstairs, packed my things fast, and left. I didn't even take a shower. I drove to a coffee shop nearby, pulled out my laptop, and reported the listing to Airbnb, explaining exactly what happened. I kept thinking about it the whole drive home. The more I replayed it in my head, the more it didn't make sense. If the host didn't install it, who did? It wasn't there when I arrived, I was sure of it. That means it either got put up while I was inside my unit, or it was hidden somehow until it was turned on. And it was aimed in a place that would catch anyone coming in or out of my door, but also could watch me if I stepped into the hallway for any reason. The sound it made at night bothered me the most. Cameras don't usually move like that unless someone is controlling them, which means if the host was telling the truth, someone else had access to that hallway and to that camera feed in real time. I didn't go back to see if Airbnb removed the listing. I didn't want to know if the camera was still there or not. All I know is I'll never stay in a place with a shared entrance again, no matter how good the reviews look or how cheap the price is. I checked into the motel just before sunset. The place was cheap, the kind you pick when you're just passing through and don't want to spend more than $40. The sign out front was flickering, a few letters dead, and the parking lot was half empty except for a few older cars and a beat-up pickup truck with a tarp tied over the bed. The building was a single row of rooms, all with chipped doors and curtains that didn't seem to close all the way. The air smelled faintly of mildew when I stepped out of my car. Inside my room, the air was stale and heavy, like it had been shut up for weeks without the window ever being opened. The carpet was thin and uneven under my shoes, the walls a dull yellow from years of cigarette smoke. The bedspread had that cheap, shiny texture that made a crinkling sound when I put my bag down. The bathroom door didn't close all the way unless you lifted it and shoved it into the frame. I started unpacking, just enough so I wouldn't have to dig through my bag later. I put my wallet and keys on the small table by the window, plugged in my phone charger, and hung my jacket on the hook by the door. The place was quiet. I couldn't even hear traffic from the road. I had just zipped my bag closed when I heard 3 soft taps on my door. They weren't loud, more like someone lightly knocking with their knuckles. I froze, halfway bent over my bag, and listened. Nothing followed. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The view was slightly warped, but I could see the walkway outside. No one was there. I stood there for a few seconds, just in case someone had stepped to the side, but it stayed empty. I told myself it was probably just a kid messing around, or maybe someone got the wrong room. I went back to unpacking and tried to ignore the little knot of unease forming in my stomach. About 5 minutes later, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just tapping on the door. The sound was directly against the glass of the peephole itself, a sharp, delicate click, 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 like a fingernail tapping the lens. My chest tightened. I didn't even check right away, I just stood still and listened. It happened again, 2 more taps. This time, when I looked, the peephole was just a blur of distorted light. I didn't see anyone, but my heart was beating faster now. I backed away from the door, grabbed the desk chair, and wedged it under the knob as tight as I could. The lock on the door was old, just a simple latch, and I didn't trust it to hold if someone really wanted in. I stood there for a long time after that, listening to the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the wall clock. No more taps came. Even though the noise had stopped, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside made me tense. Once, I thought I heard footsteps in the gravel outside my window, but when I pulled the curtain back just a little, the parking lot was empty. I kept the lights on and stayed awake longer than I planned, just scrolling on my phone and glancing at the door every couple of minutes. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to gray morning light leaking in around the curtains. My neck was stiff from sleeping in the chair. The chair was still jammed under the knob, and the door looked exactly the same. I almost convinced myself it had all just been in my head, maybe a noise from the pipes or something harmless. When I took the chair away and opened the door to step outside, that's when I saw it. Right over the peephole, there was a faint, oily smudge. It was shaped roughly like a thumbprint, with the swirl of skin ridges visible if I leaned close. The glass around it was a little fogged too, like someone's face had been right up against it for a while. I stood there for a few seconds just staring at it. It wasn't the kind of mark you'd leave by accident. It meant someone had been standing there close enough to block the peephole, tapping on it. Whoever it was had done it twice, and they had been patient enough to wait in between. The walkway outside was empty now. The parking lot was quiet, except for a man in the distance loading bags into a sedan. I scanned the lot for the beat-up pickup I'd seen the night before, but it was gone. Back in a room, I started packing right away. I didn't shower, didn't bother with breakfast. The whole time, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone watching. My hands were shaking a little as I shoved my stuff into my bag. When I checked out, the woman at the front desk barely looked up from her phone. I thought about telling her what happened, but stopped myself. What was I going to say? That someone tapped on my door and touched the peephole? She'd probably just shrug. Places like this don't ask questions, and they don't want to deal with trouble. As I walked to my car, I noticed something else. The room 2 doors down from mine had its curtain drawn open just a little, enough for someone to look out. I couldn't see anyone, but I had the sudden, heavy feeling that someone could see me. I didn't linger. Once I was in my car and driving away, I kept checking my mirrors for the first 20 miles. It wasn't just paranoia. It was that steady, quiet certainty that whoever was at my door the night before hadn't been playing a joke. They had been waiting for something. And for all I knew, if I hadn't wedged that chair under the knob, I might have found out what. That smudge on the glass stayed in my head the rest of the drive. It was proof. Proof that someone had been there, inches from my face, separated only by a thin wooden door. Proof that they had leaned in close enough for their breath to fog the glass and their skin to leave a mark. And I realized that if I hadn't looked in the morning, I would have left without knowing for sure. But now I did, and that was worse. I got into Austin late in the evening, tired from my flight and the long day of back-to-back sessions at the conference. I had booked a small Airbnb guest house in someone's backyard, about 15 minutes from downtown. The listing showed it as a separate little building. White siding, a small porch light, a single door, and one big window facing the yard. It looked private, cozy, and quiet, which was exactly what I wanted. The host had left instructions to come through a side gate and follow a stone path to the guest house. The yard was dim when I arrived, lit only by a couple of weak solar lights. The grass was short but patchy, and there were big oak trees that cast shadows over the path. The guest house was just one room, maybe 12 by 14 feet, with a small bathroom in the back. It had a queen bed, a little kitchenette, and a desk under the window. Inside, it smelled faintly of cleaning spray, like someone had just mopped. The door had a standard deadbolt and a latch lock, the kind you flip over from the inside. The window had a simple latch too. I locked both without thinking much about it. I unpacked just enough for the night, my laptop, a change of clothes, my toiletries, and then got ready for bed. The conference had run late and I hadn't eaten since lunch, so I heated up a snack in the microwave, scrolled on my phone for a while, then turned off the lights around midnight. The room was quiet except for the hum of the small fridge. It was the kind of stillness where you could hear every small sound, the settling creak of the wood, the distant hum of a car on a nearby street, the occasional chirp of a cricket outside. I must have fallen into a deep sleep because when I woke up, it was sudden. My eyes opened, and for a second, I wasn't sure why I was awake. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 4:03 a.m. The air felt colder, though the heater was still on. Then I heard it, a soft, drawn-out creak, like wood under slow pressure. I turned my head toward the door, and my stomach dropped. The door was moving. It wasn't swinging open quickly, it was slow, deliberate, like someone was easing it in from outside. The light from the porch spilled into the room in a thin strip as it opened just a few inches, and then stopped. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first thought was that I had forgotten to lock it, but I knew I had. I remembered flipping that latch before bed. I stared at the gap, straining to hear any movement, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, no sound at all. My phone was on the nightstand. I slid my hand toward it as quietly as I could. I didn't turn on the flashlight right away. My brain was running through every possibility. Maybe the wind had pushed it. Maybe the lock was loose. Maybe the host had a key and came in by mistake. But none of those felt right. I pushed myself up slowly, every muscle tight, and finally reached for the light switch by the bed. The room lit up harshly, and the sight made my skin crawl. The latch was still in place, but it wasn't sitting flush anymore. It was bent outward, like it had been forced. That was the moment I knew it wasn't the wind. Someone had pushed the door hard enough to bend the latch, but not break it completely. I scanned the room in a rush, the bathroom, under the bed, behind the kitchenette counter. It was such a small space. It didn't take more than 10 seconds to see there was no one inside. But the idea that someone had been right there on the other side of that door just minutes ago made me feel like the air had been knocked out of me. I didn't sit back down. I grabbed my bag from the desk and shoved my laptop inside, then stuffed my clothes into my suitcase without folding them. My hands were shaking so badly, I kept dropping things. I didn't even bother with the bathroom or the snacks I'd brought. My brain was locked on one thought: get out. I opened the door fully to check the yard. The porch light illuminated maybe 6 feet out before fading into darkness. The gate to the side yard was closed, but the shadows between the trees looked deeper now, heavier. The air outside was damp and carried a faint smell of wet leaves. I forced myself to step out and close the door behind me, though I knew that lock wouldn't stop much now. As I dragged my suitcase down the stone path, the wheels bumped over the uneven stones, making loud, awkward thuds that seemed too loud for the hour. I glanced over my shoulder twice, half expecting to see movement near the guest house. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched clung to me the whole way to the street. The neighborhood was quiet, no cars, no lights in the nearby houses. I stood on the curb under a weak streetlight, pulling out my phone. I searched for hotels nearby and booked the first one that showed availability. It was a few miles away, so I ordered a rideshare and waited. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, a distant dog bark, the low buzz of a passing street lamp. When the car pulled up, I got in without looking back. The driver didn't ask why I had luggage at 4 in the morning, and I was grateful for that. My hands were still trembling when I checked into the hotel. Inside my room there, I locked the door, latched the chain, and sat on the bed for a long time just listening. It was the first time in hours I felt a real barrier between me and the outside. The next morning, in daylight, I thought about going back to the guest house to grab the rest of my things, but the idea of stepping through that yard again made my stomach turn. I texted the host to let her know I was checking out early and that there had been an incident with the door. She replied a few minutes later, saying there had been some trouble with break-ins the year before, but she hadn't mentioned it in the listing because it scared guests away. Reading that made my skin crawl all over again. She didn't apologize. She didn't even sound surprised. It made me wonder how many people had slept there not knowing someone might try the door in the middle of the night. I never went back. I left the key in the mailbox and didn't care about the few items I'd left behind. That bent latch burned into my memory, proof that someone had been right there on the other side, testing how far they could push before coming in. For the rest of the trip, I double-checked every lock in every room I stayed in. Even at home now, months later, I still wake up sometimes at 4 a.m., heart pounding, certain I've heard a creak at the door. I had been on the road most of the day, the kind of long, monotonous drive where the hours blur together. By the time I pulled into the small-town motel, the sky was already fading into dark blue, and the streets outside were nearly empty. The place was nothing special, just a row of single-story rooms facing a parking lot, with a narrow pool in the center surrounded by a metal fence. The neon sign out front flickered off, and on like it wasn't sure it wanted to keep working. My room was halfway down the row, facing the pool. I parked my car right outside my door, so I could see it through the window. Inside, the room smelled faintly of bleach mixed with something older, maybe cigarette smoke from before they made it non-smoking. The carpet was thin and rough, the kind that always feels like it's holding years of dirt no vacuum could ever get out. The curtains were thick, brown, and heavy, but they didn't quite meet in the middle. I had to tug them over, so there wasn't a gap. The air conditioner hummed loudly in a wall, spitting out cool air in uneven bursts. I wasn't planning on staying awake long. I locked the door, checked the chain, and set my bag on the single chair by the wall. I'd eaten earlier at a gas station diner outside town, so I just took a quick shower and lay down. The bed was firm and creaked when I shifted. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of trucks passing now and then on the highway. I must have been asleep only a few hours when the sound yanked me awake, my car alarm blaring in the stillness. At first, I was disoriented, not even sure where I was. The shrill, repetitive beeping cut through the quiet like a drill. My heart was already pounding as I grabbed the keys from the nightstand. My first instinct was to run outside, but I hesitated. Something about the sound felt wrong. Too sudden, like someone had set it off on purpose. I stepped to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to look out. The parking lot was dim, lit only by a single orange street lamp near the front. My car sat under it, headlights reflecting faintly off the pool water. But I didn't see anyone near it, at least not at first. Then I saw them. 2 men were standing just beyond the pool fence, on the other side from my room. They weren't talking, weren't moving much at all, just standing there, both of them facing directly toward my door. The fence between us wasn't tall, just enough to keep kids from wandering into the pool. It wouldn't slow anyone down if they wanted to cross it. Neither of them looked toward the car, even with the alarm screaming. Their faces were shadowed, but their stance was still. Too still. I felt an immediate wave of unease crawl through me. I pressed the keys in my hand and hit the button, silencing the alarm. The beeping stopped, leaving a heavy quiet in its place. The men didn't move. I stepped back from the window, letting the curtain fall shut. My breathing was fast now, my hands damp. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to even look again. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe they were just guests standing out there for no reason. Maybe they weren't even looking at me. But the way they were positioned made it hard to believe that. I called the front desk. The clerk's voice was flat, uninterested. I told them about the alarm, the men, how they were staring. The only response I got was that there were no cameras facing that side of the lot, and that they could check in the morning. Morning! I stared at the phone after hanging up, wondering if I was overreacting or if the lack of concern was the real warning sign. The rest of the night was slow and tense. I lay in bed, fully awake, listening for any sound outside. Every car that passed on the road outside made my chest tighten. I thought I heard footsteps once, faint and close, but I couldn't bring myself to get up and check. The curtains stayed shut, but I could feel the dark outside pressing against the thin walls. It wasn't until the first hint of daylight bled through the gap in the curtain that I finally got up. My muscles were stiff from lying so tense for hours. I dressed quickly and stepped outside, the morning air cool and damp. The lot looked empty now, quiet. No sign of the two men. When I reached my car, the first thing I noticed was the scrape, a long, fresh mark down the driver's side, running from just behind the front wheel to near the back door. It wasn't deep enough to dent, but the paint was stripped clean in a jagged line. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw the gas cap. Or rather, the absence of it. The small door was open, the cap gone. The inside of the filler neck looked slightly scuffed, like someone had jammed something into it. I looked around the lot, scanning for any movement. A couple of other cars sat parked farther down, but no one was outside. The pool was still, its water reflecting the pale morning sky. The motel office door was propped open, but I didn't bother going in. I already knew they'd just shrug it off. I checked my fuel gauge. It hadn't dropped much, so maybe they hadn't taken any gas. Or maybe they'd just done something else I couldn't see. Either way, the message was clear. They'd been at my car, close enough to touch it, close enough to touch me if I'd stepped outside when I first heard the alarm. I drove out of that lot without looking back, the scrape catching the morning light in my side mirror. I didn't stop until I was halfway to the next town, and even then I only pulled over to check the fuel again. Everything seemed fine mechanically, but the unease stayed with me. It wasn't just the damage or the missing cap, it was the thought of them standing there, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. Whatever they had planned, they hadn't needed to rush. They knew I was inside. They knew where I was sleeping. And they knew I wasn't going anywhere until morning. That knowledge sat heavier than anything they could have taken.